Good morning and welcome to Rising. We have a great show for you today. As always, Lindsey, good to see you.
Good to see you. I feel like so much time passes between the week when we don't see each other, but it's another happy Friday.
Exactly, yeah. It's a shame we don't get to do this more often.
Yeah, we will. Tell Robbie to be absent. No,
That's right. Get out of here, Robbie.
So coming up on Rising, I'll be criticizing President Trump's latest executive order targeting homeless people.
We'll also discuss how Republicans are calling for a special counsel investigation in the Obama-Russia election probe.
And we'll talk about how the FCC is greenlighting Skydance's merger with Paramount.
President Trump says that everyone should see what is in the grand jury transcripts from an investigation into Jeffrey Epstein.
A Florida federal judge had denied the Trump administration's request to release the files, which are from 2005 and 2007.
The president took to Truth Social Thursday and said Democrats have gone absolutely crazy in fueling what he calls the Jeffrey Epstein scam. He wrote, quote, "As things are revealed, and I hope will take place quickly, you will see that it is yet another Democrat con job. Hopefully the grand jury files will put an end to this hoax. Everyone should see what is there, but people who are innocent should not be hurt." Meanwhile, Deputy Attorney General Todd Blanche met with former Epstein associate Ghislaine Maxwell. Maxwell's attorney said she answered every question and had a, quote, "very productive day." The meeting's details were not disclosed.
Now, Senator Chuck Schumer criticized the meeting. Let's take a look.
Sending Donald Trump's personal lawyer, Todd Blanche, to interview Ghislaine Maxwell while she's in prison, a woman who's been convicted of abusing people, to offer some kind of corrupt deal so that she can exonerate Donald Trump, just stinks of high corruption.
On Thursday, Democrat Senator Ruben Gallego introduced a resolution demanding Attorney General Pam Bondi release all Epstein files. Republican Senator Markwayne Mullin objected, calling Gallego's move political theater and that it wasn't Congress's job to tell the DOJ what sensitive files to release. Let's watch.
The American people are not stupid. They know something is off. They smell it. If Donald Trump really wants these files released, they'd be out already. Instead, he's orchestrating a cover-up, and he is not acting alone.
We all want transparency. All of us want transparency. We want to know actually what happened. The American people want to know what's happened. But what this resolution does is it actually is a blurred line between the separation of powers.
Also on Thursday, the New York Times added another element to the Wall Street Journal's reporting that Trump allegedly sent Epstein a bawdy birthday letter. The Times is reporting that Trump's name appeared on a contributor list for a book celebrating Epstein's 50th birthday. The Times says this is evidence that he was part of the collection, despite Trump denying he ever sent Epstein a bawdy birthday letter. There's so much here. I think like both sides of the aisle are interested in this, and it's not Democrats, obviously, for the reason of this being sensational. And I'm the first one to admit that was hilarious, and not the circumstances of the case, but the fact that everybody's piling on and finally finding something bipartisan to agree on. But I also think, to piggyback off of Chuck Schumer, like when we talk about Blanche, who now works for the DOJ, who was Trump's personal lawyer. This is somebody who represented him during his hush money trial when Trump actually became a felon, and has a very personal relationship. And that's usually what happens in government. You put people close to you in high positions that actually are equipped to do the job. But he's going there and talking to Ghislaine Maxwell. So naturally, you have to say, what is the conversation about? Because Ghislaine Maxwell, although she's in prison, has one of the most effective lawyers in the world. And so he wouldn't allow a conversation that is not necessary for Ghislaine, right? She's already charged and in prison, to happen unless there was some benefit to his client. And so the fact that they're meeting and talking, it's like, so what were the parameters around this meeting? What is the give and take? And I think that's what even more people, and even the MAGA base, is going to ask, what's happening here? And how does this elevate or push forward the story outside of a potential pardon coming down the line? And at what cost? If she does what? Because this is still somebody who harmed children.
Yeah, I mean, realistically, it seems like they're inching towards a deal, or her attorneys at least are going to try to work for a deal, whether that's reduced prison time or early release, whatever it is. But, you know, on Todd Blanche, he was a career prosecutor before joining Trump's legal team and being in government. He was a prosecutor in the Southern District of New York and had direct experience working on racketeering cases, which is obviously directly relevant to what happened with Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell. So if this meeting does get us closer to having the opportunity to prosecute some of those other individuals who were being recipients of the minors that Epstein was accused of trafficking. I think that's overall a good thing. On the grand jury files, I'm curious to see what actually gets released. Are they going to have to black out names of victims and of perhaps perpetrators, right? Because they're not going to want to release information that does catch up people who they don't have evidence to actually charge, people who may have been falsely accused. But we also want to have a conclusion to this case, because at this point, the reason why people are so dissatisfied is that they were told that there was this massive human trafficking ring of minors, and yet the only two people who have been held accountable for that are Epstein and Maxwell. So I do think the Trump administration has handled this overall very poorly, and now they're trying to basically throw a bone to the base to say, well, we'll release the grand jury transcripts, we'll talk to Ghislaine Maxwell, we'll see what we can do, when originally what they promised was to release all of the Epstein files.
And I think that's the thing. It's like these are small potatoes. Ghislaine Maxwell potentially speaking or saying anything, and then also saying that, Florida denying the request recently to release anything that they have. Like, the federal government has the capacity and access to thousands of other files that people are calling for release of. I mean, the Treasury Department, everybody has access to information that's way more important, and with names of victims, I should add, already redacted, that's way more important. So just release the information that you have the capacity and control over, as opposed to relying on the pushback from other entities saying, oh, we're not getting the information. Like, if Ghislaine doesn't cooperate, oh, we tried. Like, that is not adequate when you have information in your possession that people want to see, because allow them to say, oh, there's nothing here. I mean, it's going to take journalists and other people who are interested in this to comb through it. It's going to take lawyers and experts to comb through all the stuff the everyday person isn't going to. But when people get their hands on it, they can tell you how they feel, and you can just settle this. But I think the most disturbing part for me, as somebody who wasn't completely interested in pursuing this story so far as now it's gone, is the fact that even with the Trump administration, who generally is unafraid of having direct conversations, they are telling or calling the entire staff, from reports with NBC News, to say tight-lipped about Epstein, be in line with what the messaging is. So this is a redirection from what they usually do, as well as just also throwing these other bones that are completely erroneous at this exact time. Like, oh, MLK is out right now, or oh my gosh, we're gonna put Obama in jail. And it's just like all over the place. It seems like a frantic measure to say, look over here, we're not talking about Epstein.
Yeah, the Daily Caller did talk to some senior administration officials a few weeks ago when the memo was first released from the DOJ, indicating that they wouldn't be releasing all of the files and that there was no further investigation or prosecutions happening. And those individuals were really upset and frustrated with the way that it was handled by the DOJ. They felt like, one, Pam Bondi saying that there was the phase 1 binder and handing that over to influencers, but then never releasing the phase 2, saying on TV that she had the client list on her desk when she hadn't even apparently reviewed the documents that were on her desk, obviously gave the perception that this administration is involved in a cover-up. I also think it's transparent to people, though, that the Democrats see this as a political wedge issue, because they had 4 years under Biden where they could have called for the release of the files. They had total control of government at one point during that time frame where they could have released them themselves, and they never called for that. And when Hakeem Jeffries was asked about this during a recent press conference, he said, well, you people just keep bringing up Biden. But I think it is a salient point.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely playing politics here, so I can be the first one to admit that. But I think now we're here and they have to release them.
Yeah, I agree. All right, Republican congressman now calling for a special counsel into the Obama-Russia probe after Tulsi Gabbard accusing some of the Obama administration of treasonous conspiracy. We'll break it down after the break.
But remember this, Obama cheated on the election. And we have it cold, hard, blue, and it's getting even more so because the stuff that's coming in is not even believable.
The Trump administration and some Republican senators have their eyes set on former President Barack Obama. Senators Lindsey and John Cornyn are calling for a special counsel to investigate the former president. This is all due to National Intelligence Director Tulsi Gabbard releasing documents alleging Obama-era officials manipulated intelligence related to Russia's interference in the 2016 election. She even accused some officials of, quote, treasonous conspiracy. Gabbard spoke on the matter this week during the White House press briefing. Let's listen.
Of this are far-reaching and have to do with the integrity of our democratic republic. It has to do with an outgoing president taking action to manufacture intelligence to undermine and usurp the will of the American people in that election and launch what would be a years-long coup against the incoming President of the United States, Donald Trump.
Now, an Obama spokesperson has denied any claims of alleged treason by the former president, and the Trump administration has yet to show any proof of these accusations. This comes at a time when the Trump administration is trying to pivot the spotlight away from the Epstein files. But even if Republicans find Obama did commit a crime while in office, the new Supreme Court ruling may give him immunity against any prosecution. White House spokesperson was asked about this during a press briefing. Here's what she had to say.
Look, the president has made it clear that he wanted these documents to be declassified. He wanted the American people to see the truth, and now he wants those who perpetuated these lies and this scandal to be held accountable. As for what accountability looks like, as the director said, it's in the Department of Justice's hands, and we trust them to move this ball forward.
Well, you would agree
Stephanie.
President Obama cannot be charged based on that immunity.
Again, I'll leave that to the Department of Justice.
So I just admit that the Democrats were, playing a few games in the last segment, talking about in relation to the Epstein files and their lack of interest a few years ago to right now. And I think if Republicans are honest right now, this feels like political retaliation in many ways, because they understand this won't go very far. This will waste taxpayers' dollars, opening up an entirely new inquiry, spending time trying to litigate this in Congress before it actually gets litigated, and then he has complete immunity. And I think that this pattern of retribution is something that President Trump kind of promised and almost guaranteed on the campaign trail, and it's something that we're seeing him follow through with at a time when it's very convenient, because he has another issue on his hands, which is Epstein, and this is it's growing in popularity among the base, but I still don't know that it's worth all of what we're doing right now, because at the end of the day, people shouldn't have wanted Russia, even if it's a smaller involvement than suggested, involved in any part of our election or meddling in any part of our social media conversations around the election, or even suggesting that they like a candidate better, because what does it have to do with the Russian population?
It was fair to say, I think, that the timing of this is suspect and probably trying to serve as a distraction from the Epstein files. However, what I found in the documents related to the emails and other communications that were released by Tulsi Gabbard was really a confirmation of what a lot of Republicans said about the Russian investigation into Donald Trump during the 2016 election. And some really concerning things that I think actually do warrant congressional investigation and perhaps even litigation. What we found in these documents is that the Obama administration, their own intelligence analysts were telling them that they did not believe that Russia had the capacity or even the desire to hack the election, as was termed at the time, and that they only had a limited role in trying to sow division. But before and after the election, we see different things coming out of the intelligence community. According to these documents, what happened was the intelligence analysts prior to Trump getting elected were saying that the Russians tried to hurt both candidates, that they were interfering. Nobody disputes that they wanted to interfere in the election. They do that in every single election. But then after Trump won, all of a sudden the IC conclusions were saying that they were actively trying to help Trump, which was the predicate for Crossfire Hurricane, suggesting that the Trump campaign had actively colluded with the Russians. And these email documents indicate that it was CIA Director John Brennan, then DNI James Clapper, and the president himself who told these intelligence analysts to reach a different conclusion than what they had been saying in these private meetings. In fact, one of the most concerning parts is that when Trump started receiving the presidential daily briefing, which is something that every president-elect has access to, they were set to brief the president in one of those intelligence meetings on the idea that Russia had not actively tried to help Trump. Obama canceled that meeting and then said that they need to go back and basically look again, and all of a sudden the new presidential daily briefing included this assessment that they had tried to actively help Trump. So this was the manipulated intelligence that Tulsi Gabbard was talking about, and if it was the case that Brennan, Clapper, Obama, and other high-level IC officials were changing conclusions using things like the Steele dossier or things like confidential informants that were not deemed trustworthy by these intelligence analysts, then that is a crime.
Yeah, and I think what Tulsi Gabbard unsealed this week, it raises questions about how connected, like you said, Vladimir Putin was to Trump and how much collusion was there. But I don't think it raises the questions about whether Russia interfered with the election at all. And so
I agree.
Is it worth looking into from a president? Whether they spent too much time and effort on it is one thing, but whether it's a treasonous conspiracy, I feel like it's overcomplicating the situation, because people have the decision as president and having their cabinet members and their entire team looking into stuff. This is something that's worth, you said it happens in every election, but I think that to know that there was information coming out specifically about Hillary Clinton, to know that there was an intentional, support from my purview for Trump, it seems that combing through all this information shows that there was an intended bias and so then naturally the question would be like, what is the connection for Trump to Putin, and what is the point here? And the Senate Intelligence Committee, which is led by Senator Marco Rubio at the time, that came up with some of these conclusions, who's now Trump's Secretary of State. I mean, why are we not talking to him? He was on the forefront of everything happening, and this is a bipartisan committee that decided and came up with this information that yes, Trump did not collude with Vladimir Putin. However, Russia and its intelligence was trying to seep into our election and impact it in ways that would benefit President Trump. And so that is problematic. And we decided as a bipartisan government to move forward with this. So peeling it back and trying to find a treasonous conspiracy in this seems like an overreach and an intended distraction more than anything else.
Well, again, the problem isn't that there's a conclusion that Russia interfered. Everybody agrees with that. But the problem is that they use that to then claim that they were actively trying to help Trump, which led to, again, the investigation claiming that
releasing
Trump
stuff
colluded.
about Hillary, is that not actively trying to
Okay,
help?
so there's a couple of issues with that. The first of which is that the Steele dossier itself has since been deemed the product of Russian disinformation, meaning Russian spies were feeding a lot of those false claims to Michael Steele, who then passed that along to the FBI. So they did release damaging information on Trump. And what these documents also show is that they had a whole list of other accusations against Hillary Clinton that they did not release, including claims that she was on barbiturates, that she was not mentally well, that she had issues with suicidality. None of those got released during the election. So if it was really the Russians' goal to merely damage Hillary and not damage Trump, none of those things would have happened. So, I mean, it's nice to say, yes, we should look forward and move on. We know Russia interfered, but ultimately there were people, including the president himself, who spent his entire first term battling accusations of collusion, to the point that 3/4 of Democrats believed that Trump had colluded with the Russian government because of this investigation. And we also saw multiple members of his team have their reputations destroyed, have to spend millions of dollars in defense fees, people like Michael Flynn and Michael Caputo. It was really a scandalous time in our nation's history. And if Obama and his intelligence officials were deliberately manipulating evidence and intel in order to try to spark that investigation, that needs to be held accountable.
Well, I know we're going to be talking a lot more about this. We're running out of time, but we have a lot to say here, and Trump is not going to let this go.
No, definitely not. All right, Time Magazine released its 100 Best Podcasts, and you might be shocked at who didn't make the cut. Don't go anywhere.
Call Her Daddy, The Daily, and The Ezra Klein Show all made the cut in Time's top 100 best podcasts of all time. Noticeably absent from the list is the Joe Rogan Experience. Joe Rogan, whose podcast consistently ranks as one of the most popular globally, has featured big names from Elon Musk, Mark Zuckerberg, to Edward Snowden, and arguably most consequential then candidate Donald Trump shortly before the 2024 election.
Many users are perplexed at times snubbing Rogan from the list. EV Magazine founder Brittany Hugoboom posting on X, quote, "This is exactly why the youth doesn't trust legacy media. The left has long dominated film, television, and fashion. But when it comes to podcasts, especially among men, the right owns the space." Ex-user account Storm posted, quote, "The Joe Rogan Experience is the most listened to podcast on the planet. Omitting it from the list of best podcasts of all time is like omitting the Beatles from the list of best music artists of all time."
Good analogy. Time correspondent Elena Dockerman explained how the magazine compiled the list. She wrote in part, quote, "I tried to pick podcasts that, if not entirely evergreen, have a hefty archive that can be revisited. Series that cracked jokes that haven't gotten old, or covered books and movies you can still read and watch before tuning into a specific episode that will help you appreciate them more fully. With this list, I endeavored to find the best of the best, a database you can sort through by genre.
This is definitely interesting. I think it's no secret where I stand on this. Joe Rogan's podcast should have been included. It's very strange to me that the most popular podcast of all time is not on the list. Even if you don't personally like it, when you're compiling these best ofs, you got to approach it with a little bit of objectivity and say, there's obviously something about this that is very compelling to people.
Now, I love Time Magazine, and I also love Joe Rogan's show. And so I was completely confused because not only does he, if you don't like the content or material or don't feel that it's evergreen, which I would disagree with,
right.
The fact is that he has broken barriers in all ways by putting his stuff on YouTube and Spotify, distribution barriers. He has opened and changed the game. He has 3-hour-long episodes. I remember when I got wrapped up, what was it? I watched the Bob Lazar for 2.5 hours about aliens, Area 51. This is not my cup of tea. Robbie asked me in the past, like, what do I think about aliens? And I just don't think about it because I will get terrified. And this is something I spent 2 hours on. And that's how you know you have a captivated audience, when you're not normally into the subject matter, but will spend a hefty amount of time watching a full video or listening to that type of content. To me, that transcends barriers. And so this is a time where Time Magazine really, I think, dropped the ball and made it maybe too serious, but none of these lists are ever objective, and that's why everybody always gets mad. Like, best albums of all time, best R&B, whether Beyonce should be country. It's just like always these conversations about what's going on, and it always frustrates somebody, so they're never going to get it right. But this seems like an intentional kind of dig.
It does. I think it was a slight, and I mean, the thing that's so nice about Joe Rogan's show is that he's obviously not claiming to be an expert. He isn't an expert. So you almost feel like you're sitting in his seat when you're listening, because he asks a lot of questions that a normal viewer might want to ask of these experts or these really high-profile figures that he has access to. So you feel like as you're listening to this expert, maybe you get caught up on something or you get confused. And Joe's there, and he's also confused, and he's going to ask that for you and make sure that it's covered in the next answer, and that's why I think it's so engaging for people.
And I think also it's interesting because they put Call Her Daddy on there, which, if you know that podcast, she had Kamala Harris on,
right.
And she was like the response to the big Joe Rogan Trump interview. And so to pick one or the other, you have to put both. You know, they both were timely relevant. And honestly, the Joe Rogan Trump interview changed the course of the election. That and Biden's misstep at that debate were two significant moments in last year's election season. So I don't know how you say that wasn't the most powerful podcast of all time, that specific episode.
Yeah, especially since there was that debate over whether Joe Rogan did enough to try to get Kamala on the podcast, or if Kamala did enough to get on the podcast, and whether he should travel, and all of this sort of gossip about how that interview ended up not happening. That was a huge part of it too, was her campaign being accused of really dropping the ball by not following up Trump's episode.
Right, so much to talk about here. Time Magazine, you got to get it right. President Trump is issuing a new executive order addressing homelessness, but it may hurt more than it helps. So we'll talk about that next in My Lens. Stick around.
Okay, Lindsey, tell us what's in your lens today.
Yeah, so President Trump signed an executive order making it easier for cities and states to remove homeless people from the streets and get them treatment elsewhere. The order also calls on Attorney General Pam Bondi to, quote, seek in appropriate cases the reversal of federal or state judicial precedents and the termination of consent decrees that impede the United States policy of encouraging civil commitment of individuals with mental illness who pose risks to themselves or the public, according to a White House fact sheet. On the surface, this is framed as a solution, but underneath it represents a troubling expansion of forced institutionalization with few real answers about that long-term care. President Trump's recent executive order on homelessness, which prioritizes forced relocation of unhoused people to treatment centers and penalizes open-air encampments, reads more like a campaign tactic than a compassionate or effective public policy. Now, while public frustration around homelessness is understandable, this order channels that frustration in the wrong direction, targeting symptoms instead of causes and people instead of systems. Framing homelessness as a threat to public safety rather than a humanitarian crisis is not only dangerous, it's inaccurate. White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt said, quote, by removing vagrant criminals from our streets and redirecting resources towards substance abuse programs, the Trump administration will ensure that Americans feel safe in their own communities. Now, this kind of language paints unhoused people as these violent offenders, despite studies like one from the University of Central Florida showing that unhoused individuals are typically arrested for non-violent infractions like public intoxication or shoplifting, not for violent crimes. In fact, research shows they are far more likely to be victims of violence than perpetrators. Trump's approach to homelessness relies on institutionalization, encampment sweeps, and prioritizing states that crack down on outdoor sleeping. But it offers no real investment in building or preserving affordable housing, which experts across the political spectrum agree is the core issue. Jesse Rabinowitz of the National Homelessness Law Center said it best, quote, Trump's expected actions are reckless, expensive, and make homelessness worse. Real leaders focus on solutions, not kicking people when they're down. Supporters of the order argue that it gets people into treatment, but forced treatment rarely ever leads to long-term recovery, especially when it's divorced from stable housing. Research has consistently shown that housing first, which prioritizes placing people in permanent housing before mandating treatment or sobriety, reduces homelessness by up to 88% and lowers costly emergency care visits. The problem isn't that housing first failed, it's that we underfunded it and we were inconsistent with it. We were inconsistent in the way we applied it across the country. This order also disproportionately affects Black and brown communities, LGBTQ people, and people with disabilities, groups that are already overrepresented in the unhoused population. And in cities like D.C., where Trump is directing federal agencies to evict people from public parks, the move will simply push people out of sight, further away from services and case managers. A few high-profile tragic incidents involving homeless individuals should not dictate national policy. Fear should not be our driving response to poverty. If we want real results, we need real solutions. Housing, mental health access, wraparound services, and most importantly, we have to have humanity. Homelessness isn't a crime, and treating it like one is not going to solve it.
All right, so really interesting executive order from the Trump administration here. I had a couple of things I wanted to touch on that you talked about in your lens. The first of which being the housing first policy that you're talking about. And I suppose I disagree with the premise that housing first has been effective or that it would be more effective if it had more funding. We saw that between 2018 and 2023, permanent supportive housing in the United States increased by 30%. But at the same period of time, homelessness grew by 60%. And specifically in Arizona, in 2024, they had 9,435 people that were considered homeless, whereas they had 9,797 permanent housing units, and yet homelessness grew again over the past year. In fact, they built over 7,000 permanent housing units since 2010, but homelessness increased 50%. So I guess I would just be curious where the evidence is that putting people in housing first before addressing the substance abuse and mental illness problems is an effective strategy.
Well, I think what Housing First was implemented in 2004 under a Republican president, George Bush in his administration. And I think like following through, a lot of times we have these federal programs that we will implement and sound like a good idea and then get pushed through. This was kind of bipartisan, right? Because then Obama followed it up and continued it. And I think just putting the right funding and implementing it properly alongside treatment for people, right? Because we know that when we paint them, which is the bigger point, as criminals or paint them in any other way versus misunderstood, and maybe all of them don't need substance abuse addiction resources or institutionalization, they might need a roof over their head. And when we think about the core issue and what's starting all of this is that people don't have access to anything, whether it's care or housing. And so putting them in a covered roof over their head and providing a stability, which is, I think, the baseline, which I'm talking about, to get people to get better health. Like, you could ask people to be as healthy as they want to be as unaddicted to anything as you want to, but if they have nowhere to go, desperate times, right, call for desperate measures, which would lead to that turnaround where you're back on drugs or back in the street. And so what I'm saying is give people an opportunity to clean up their act in a way that leads with humanity first by providing some sort of shelter and then allowing them to grow past that, because the basic needs are just the basic needs. And so that's kind of what I'm talking about when I say that we need to make sure that we're doing things in tandem. And I think starting with housing would probably be more effective than just throwing everybody into, an institution where they can possibly get care and it could possibly not be effective.
If somebody were addicted to drugs or struggling from mental illness, would you support them getting treatment if there were a permanent housing solution or a halfway house after the fact?
For sure. Yeah, I think that we have to, and also I guess the problem with Trump's policy, to finish answering the question, is that there's the executive order the problem with most executive orders, right? They're not fully instituted until they're codified by Congress. But also, when you think about what's next, like, yes, getting people off the streets and, mostly Democratic leadership by making their cities suffer if they don't get people off the streets immediately, and, finding people that have encampments and doing all those kind of things help. But what's the long-term solution when people do get off the streets, when people do get substance abuse treatment? Like, what are the next steps? And those are important to point out, and not just in the executive order, but when we hash this through Congress, when we actually make this a full policy, what are those next steps? Because that has to be clear, because then otherwise we just have people who went through some sort of short reformation program and then maybe turn right back around to the same things.
One of the things that I found interesting related to the DC homelessness crisis was that during the Obama administration in 2022 to 2023, they actually directed the National Park Service to start this process of cleaning the encampments out of the public parks. I was present for the clearing out at McPherson Square. I know they did it at Columbus Circle prior to Biden giving his big speech from Union Station. And what they found at that time in the data was that there was ample enough shelter space for the homelessness population in DC, but the problem that they were having was that people would not go into the shelters because they either had to give up their tent or they had to not abuse drugs. And so that was sort of the sticking point for me, where I thought, okay, well, we need to treat the root causes of why they're homeless first. Otherwise, we're not going to be able to keep them in permanent housing and make sure that they're getting well. And to me, that's not really a compassionate solution either. To either you have two solutions: you leave people on the streets, or you put someone who's struggling with one of these issues in a house that's going to get potentially destroyed. In LA, for example, during COVID, they decided to put a lot of the homeless population in the hotels, and now a lot of those hotels are suing the LA government for hundreds of millions of dollars in damages.
And I think also it might be a little bit of a fundamental, cart before the horse thing, because do people lose everything and then get on drugs because they have nothing anymore? Or do people get on drugs and, it's like this circle merry-go-round. So it's kind of hard to decipher, but I just want a well thought out plan and not just everything executive order style.
All right, coming up next, big news for Paramount and Skydance. The FCC has approved their massive media merger. We'll break it all down next. Stay with us. Some major breaking news yesterday. The merger between Paramount and Skydance was officially approved by the Federal Communications Commission. That merger was at the center of the controversy surrounding both the recent cancellation of The Late Show with Stephen Colbert and the $16 million settlement between President Trump and Paramount over an interview CBS's 60 Minutes did with Kamala Harris late last year.
Now, both the cancellation and the settlement have been seen by some as a capitulation to the Trump administration to, quote, grease the wheels, so to speak, on the massive merger. Democrats were quick to double down on that criticism. Let's take a listen.
It's not a coincidence, it's a plan. And never before has the FCC approved a merger under these circumstances. Beyond the apparent corruption, this agreement is also a direct threat to CBS's journalism.
The appearance of this wink-wink deal basically lets every other company and every other billionaire know that Trump is open for business, apparently happy to accept offers in exchange for favors.
Meantime, many on the right are praising the deal for Skydance's promise to end DEI. Conservative commentator Robbie Starbuck said in a post on X, quote, "Once the Paramount sale is done, Skydance will end all DEI and appoint an official whose job will be focused on eliminating media bias." FCC Chair Brendan Carr has once again delivered.
Now, the news of the merger came mere hours after the popular show South Park signed a monster 5-year, $1.5 billion deal with Paramount and then aired its Bawdy Season 27 premiere, skewering both Trump and its newly signed parent company in the process. The episode included several unflattering depictions of Trump, including likening him to the show's past depiction of former Iraqi dictator Saddam Hussein. The show also took shots at Paramount and CBS, mocking them for being afraid to criticize the president. Let's take a short look.
This is 60 Minutes. Oh, boy. Oh, God. The small town of South Park, Colorado is protesting against the president. The townspeople claim that the president, who is a great man.
A great man.
Great guy.
There's so much satire there.
It is. I love South Park, always have. I think it's funny. They skewer both sides. It's great. They're one of the few comedy shows that actually effectively, I think, criticizes both sides of the political aisle, and it's fun. I do think this South Park episode airing, they obviously recently had a deal with Paramount for, what was it, $1 billion to air those episodes, suggests that the Colbert cancellation was not, at least entirely, driven by the desire for Paramount to want to get this merger done. Otherwise, the idea that they would have let South Park air this would be ludicrous.
Well, I think the difference for me, I thought a lot about that because I watched this and I was like, oh, wow, they went all the way in. But I think with Colbert, it's a person that you see eye to eye. Like President Trump is like, okay, you're a successful businessman, so am I, outside of like being a president and being a talk show host. And you are, for President Trump, probably talking smack about me as a person that I can put the opinion next to the name, and you're boldly standing firm every night and doing that on television. And he feels strongly about Colbert. And he also has went on Truth Social and said, look, you know, basically, I'm happy that he got let go. If I had something to do with it, he's touting, like, attaching himself to it. And part of the problem is all the things that happen in that merger. Like, these are businessmen, right? Businessmen and women. They're coming to the table talking about getting rid of DEI, having some internal outside auditor go through all the systems to make sure that CBS News is reporting factual and you know, accurate information. There's all these agreements that went into an $8 billion merger. And I think that one of those agreements could have easily been a handshake conversation. Like, okay, get rid of the show, because I don't think that even Comedy Central has the same type of gets on Trump's nerves or gets to his ego in the same way that Colbert may have, and with Colbert's audience. Now, also, it's a money thing. If he really was losing $40 million, then that's just the name of the game, right? Yeah. The answer to most questions is money. And so I think that that has to be said. But also, you know, President Trump got mad about South Park. But like you said, if they're coming at both sides, then he can't be that mad. But if Colbert, people feel like he always is attacking President Trump, this could be part of the agreement. And then that lends the question of, like, how much do you have to cater to President Trump in order to make things happen? Like, we should have the FCC looking over deals because we don't want monopolies, because we want to protect, you know, fairness across the board. We shouldn't have the FCC stopping or looking over deals because President Trump doesn't personally like somebody, or President Trump feels like Kamala's interview took too much breath out. You know, there wasn't something so egregious there that it was worth $16 million. And finally, I think that CBS and Paramount plan to not cater to or plan to not say anything about Trump's accusations about editing that interview. But then they were surprised by Trump's win, and they realized they had to play ball. But I think the initial plan was to keep moving forward, and now they're like, oh, well, we're not going to get to move forward in any way because Trump's blocking it based off a personal vendetta, which we know is his MO.
The $40 million lost per year on the Colbert Show was really the number that stuck out to me too. And the guy gets paid $20 million of that. So it's like, how can that possibly stay afloat? The fact that they're even giving him until next May to film a final season, I think is incredibly generous if it really is such a money loser. But one of the other things that I wanted to get into about this merger, the DEI thing, whatever, you throw a bone to the Trump administration in his base, that's great. But one of the connections that this has to a recent media deal in the UK, which is that Redbird, which is a capital investment company in the US, but they also have a separate Redbird branch in the UAE, is a minority investor in Skydance. And people have been raising red flags about Redbird's connections to the Chinese Communist Party. Its chairman, John Thornton, has received a bunch of awards from the CCP. He has talked openly about how the CCP needs to get into English language media in order to tell the Chinese story, basically exert influence on the rest of the world. And Redbird was recently involved in the purchase of the Telegraph, the sort of iconic, infamous newspaper in the UK, where the House of Lords actually voted to increase a cap from 5% to 15% on foreign ownership stakes in media, so that the deal could go through. So that's one of the sort of underreported parts of the story that I find really interesting. I don't know exactly what percentage stake Redbird has in Skydance, but I'm surprised that no one has brought this up.
But doesn't that raise a red flag for you about what now becomes this, even if it's a subtle messaging, whether it's Redbird's attachment and then what maybe the tone might change on stories that have to do with China?
Totally.
And, but then also there's a subtle messaging that we're going to get because part of the agreement that Paramount agreed to with Trump was 15 to 20 million roughly in ads or favorable language and programming and advertisements around President Trump. And so if you think about that, that is basically almost like an agreement of propaganda, like $20 million of just like saying it's not campaign season. Like, what are we going to see this as? Like, just embedded in news stories? Like, I'm concerned about the autonomy now that it feels like CBS News does not have, even though I know they're going to try to continue to operate, particularly 60 Minutes, as a separate news entity. But when you think about now this Redbird story, which you just brought to my attention, and thank you for that, as well as what the agreements, under the table may have been with President Trump, as well as what we've got to read through all the listed agreements that were reported on by journalists, it makes me question about what we're going to see in the next few months or few years that will really create some kind of bias. And probably, even if it's subtle, like, will we know all about this? And is news kind of changing in a way based on ownership? I mean, we even see that with Washington Post and Jeff Bezos owning it. A lot of people left because they feel like it's changing directions. And so is that a good thing to have new leadership and try new things? Is it also a good thing to have billionaires running news organizations? Like, it's just such a larger conversation when news is attached to it.
Yeah, especially since a lot of local news outlets are now owned by these mega conglomerates that are owned by the billionaires too. So people wonder, well, what happened to local news? It doesn't seem as salient as it used to, and maybe it's overly nationalized. And I think that's because of the ownership structure, where a lot of these places, sure, maybe they couldn't stand up financially on their own, but is the alternative really that much better? The ad question is interesting. I imagine it's probably going to be midterm ads. Trump, perhaps from his PACs, will support Republican candidates in 2026. But I would imagine, since they are a broadcast network, that they would have to provide equal airtime then to the other side.
Right, because that's part of the agreement. But then it also, ads can run across the board. So they own a ton of things under the Paramount umbrella. So what does that mean when the ads run on many of their other platforms that they own? And so, I know that there are FCC rules, but then the FCC is working on behalf of President Trump to kind of do what I view as some of his targeted favors based on retribution that he planned to get. And so if that is a part of the conversation, it just concerns me of what people will be consuming unknowingly.
Yeah, I think it'll be curious to see what happens over the next year or two, and we can kind of tell based on the content whether this had a significant impact on the news gathering side of their business.
Right. Up next, President Trump wants Elon's AI company to thrive. Is he trying to patch things up with Musk? We'll tell you more. Stay tuned. So is President Trump patching things up with Elon Musk? Well, Trump said Thursday he wants Musk to thrive.
In a Truth Social post, Trump wrote, "Everyone is stating that I will destroy Elon's companies by taking away some, if not all, of the large-scale subsidies he receives from the U.S. government. This is not so. I want Elon and all businesses within our country to thrive. In fact, thrive like never before. The better they do, the better the USA does, and that's good for all of us. We are setting records every day, and I want to keep it that way."
This comes a day after White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt said President Trump probably won't support Musk's AI business expanding federal contracts. Let's listen.
First on AI, does President Trump support federal agencies contracting with Elon Musk's AI company?
I don't think so, no.
Okay, so he would want the DOJ to then cancel the contract with Musk.
I'll talk to him about it, yes.
Meanwhile, Tesla shares fell over 9% Thursday after the company reported disappointing earnings. Musk warned employees of a potential few rough quarters ahead. The EV cuts in Trump's recently signed tax bill could compound challenges for Tesla.
So we saw the secret meeting earlier this week, or reported on earlier this week, that Jeff Bezos was at the White House. And so people were like, Blue Origin taking over. So I think that it's like the battle of the egos and the billionaires. And so I think that Trump is probably walking a fine line of making an enemy out of Elon Musk, because my theory is that Elon Musk will see this thing through. Like, even just announcing that he might come back into politics and do his own party. You remember, like, even though people might take it as a joke with how far he might make it to the presidency, you have to take it as a real life example when you look at Ross Perot in the 90s and how he got 19% of the vote. If Elon does that same thing with his own party, then here we are with the Republicans losing potentially and mostly 19% of their vote. And he's following the same strategy as Ross Perot. I mean, tech billionaire getting into politics, saying you want to do your own party, you don't align with either side. It could go that way easily. And I think if you look at the writing on the wall and how much money Elon Musk has to play with, you don't want him as your enemy in the midterms or the general election. And so I think Trump knows that.
Yeah, I think that's probably part of it. I mean, the other part, just based on people we've talked to around the White House, is that Trump and Elon actually did have a lot of respect for each other. They were really good friends, and Trump was actually quite saddened by the way Elon turned on him, and there's still some mutual respect there. So I think that just based on their personal relationship, there's also the element of, well, I don't want to go too hard on this guy because I feel like he kind of had a meltdown, and it's not really fair to kick him while he's down. Obviously, his companies aren't doing well. He left the White House basically in disgrace and then popped off on X repeatedly about the president, which was a tough scene. On the America Party point, I think one of the underreported things that people aren't really talking about is apparently they're pretty narrowly focused, at least at this point, on some House and Senate races that they think are winnable, mostly because they know that the Democrats and Republicans often have a slim majority in either direction in those chambers of Congress, and they want to try to have legislators in there who have some influence on deficit spending and the budget and things like that. So I would be surprised if at this point he immediately escalates to trying to launch a presidential bid, especially if, as you said, Trump continues to kind of play nice.
I can agree with that letting down, because when you think about it, it feels like, and I haven't talked to Elon's team personally, but it feels like he was completely like flabbergasted by the amount that was being spent with this big, beautiful bill. And he seemed genuinely like, I cannot believe it. Just the way that he was erratically, and not that he doesn't do this about a lot of topics, but with that one, it felt like he was genuinely let down. Like he thought he came to the government to change things and left with his tail tucked. And so we've seen that he's not the first billionaire to try to impact government, but I think that he generally probably wants to see change. So whatever way he can do that, whether putting people in Congress or running himself, I think he's going to probably really try, because not only as a vendetta against Trump, he just he thinks he understands business better than everyone.
Yeah, I think he actually really does care about the deficit. And I know a lot of people were saying, well, when Elon went in, it was just because he wanted more subsidies for his business and he wanted influence. And like, maybe that's partially true, but based on his behavior since he left, this is obviously an issue that's deeply personal to him, and he actually really cares about it. We also have this argument over subsidies still going to this day, whether he asked for the EV credits to be removed or not. There's a lot of dispute about that. So it's very interesting. I'm very interested to see what the Elon-Trump relationship is, a year, 2 years down the line.
And the only part that has me shook is the fact that President Trump doesn't hold tongue for anybody. So the fact that he's like on the fence about where to go with Elon is very interesting to watch.
It
like,
is interesting.
What is it that Elon, or what is it that you like so much about him, or what does he have on you that's making you calmer than normal? Which we all don't know that. That does it for us on Rising Live. Look out for more exclusive YouTube content coming your way. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe on The Hill's YouTube channel so you never miss any content. And for those of you who like to listen on the go, we're available anywhere you listen to podcasts. See you next time.